I go. So I have only shot a few rolls of film, but the improvements I've been able to make in quite a short time have been quite significant. And I've done that by changing how I was shooting and the way I was setting up to take a photo. And I've narrowed it down to 5 things. So in this video, I just want to run through 5 tips on how you can get better photos with your medium format film camera. And hopefully they're of some use to you. Huge bee. So I don't actually have one with me at the minute. I left it in the car. But a tripod, I think, is one of the most important things, especially for landscape photography, but even more so when you're using a medium format camera. It allows you to take your time for a start, really nail your focus, because the depth of field is so shallow. It's such a shallow depth on medium format cameras that getting that focus perfect, especially with a TLR like this, when you're trying to get things straight and you're trying to make sure your focus is spot on, especially through a viewfinder which isn't the brightest, can take a little time, and doing that on a tripod is just much easier. And then once you get focus, it isn't gonna move. When you're handheld and shot, when you're holding the camera in your hands and focusing, you're obviously moving a wee bit. It's hard to keep it exactly where it was when you focused. So there's that. And then also, if you want to use slower shutters, having it on a tripod just means there's going to be a lot less chance of motion blur. Okay, so aperture, I think, is probably one of the biggest reasons why I was able to improve my photos from my first roll to my third roll of film. For the first roll of film, I was shooting portrait 160, and I didn't have a tripod, which forced me to use lower apertures for almost every shot, and they didn't all work out. I missed focus just, and the scenes weren't all in focus like I had wanted to, and that's because a medium format camera is not the same as a crop sensor like the Fuji we have. So if we were to shoot a photo of a scene on both cameras to make sure that the same amount of the scene was in focus, this medium format film camera would have to have a higher aperture than the Fuji. Hopefully that makes sense. I'll show you some examples. We're running out of memory and light, so might have to head back to do that. Okay, back inside again. It wasn't the plan. There was a little bit of confusion as to what camera we were going to shoot on, and I made a lot of room on the memory card for the Sony, and then we decided to use the Fuji, and it didn't have memory, but anyway, here we are. Okay, so for this first photo, which was actually shot on my first ever roll of film, it was at Character Reed, which some of you may have seen from other videos, and it was getting quite late on. I thought I'll try to capture this sort of scene. It looked quite cool through the viewfinder. I believe I shot at f5.6. If that's wrong, I'll put it on screen now, but it just didn't work. There's just simply too much of this scene that is out of focus because I didn't use a high enough aperture. It was just a mistake I made. I hadn't really used medium format before, and especially not medium format film, and yeah, I didn't use a high enough aperture to get enough of the scene in focus, so it just doesn't really look great, and I probably didn't spend long enough framing up the shot. So yeah, it's not really a great shot at all. Compared to this photo, which is one from the most recent roll that I shot in Donegal, of the bench and these two trees and the mountains in the distance, I used a much higher aperture. I believe it was f11, and as you can see, everything that I needed in focus is in focus, from the bench to the trees and the mountain in the distance. Everything turned out exactly as I wanted it to. So that's definitely one problem that I had on both the first and second rolls of film that I now think I have figured out. And I think that's a problem that most people coming from an APS-C camera or even full frame 35mm may have, because you're not used to having to shoot at such a high aperture most of the time. Maybe landscape photographers are different because they always want pretty much everything in the scene to be in focus, but for the normal travel lifestyle photographer, normally we're shooting at a max f8, and with medium format you do need to shoot at a higher aperture, especially for landscape scenes like that one that I just showed you. Now, another thing that follows on from that very nicely is nailing your focus, and this is another thing I've had to change from my first roll, where I made quite a few mistakes and couldn't quite understand it, and the same in the second roll too, and I think I'm slowly coming to grips with it. I think. Also, I have only been using this TLR camera to shoot all my film, and I think most of these tips will apply anyway, but it may be a little easier if you're using an SLR because the focusing and stuff just is a little bit easier than using this thing, as fun as it may be. But yeah, so focusing. If you've seen the first couple of videos where I was shooting film, you'll know that I had a few problems with focusing and getting the scans back, and nothing in some of the shots being in focus, and I couldn't quite understand it. I'm not sure I totally understand it yet, but I've definitely made improvements and got the results that I wanted in the most recent roll that you may have seen. And what I noticed from those photos where I had missed focus was that I was focusing to infinity. So I was turning the knob the whole way as far as it could go, which was focusing on infinity, and through the viewfinder, to me, the furthest thing, or the mountains in the distance, for example, I was trying to focus on in one of the shots, looked to be in focus, and then I was shooting most of them at f5.6 as well. Get the scans back, and nothing in the shot looked to be in focus, which was quite confusing to me. And I thought, okay, I'm not going to do the infinity focus anymore. I'm going to pick something sort of in the middle of the frame, as well as using a higher aperture, and hopefully then see how that turns out. And as you've seen from the most recent photos, that worked out much better. Now, there may still be the possibility of there being a problem with my camera and a difference between the taking lens, the viewing lens, or the ground glass, but somehow I don't feel like that's the case. But yeah, maybe something you can try out if you're shooting landscape type scenes. Pick something in the center of the frame, focus on it, and then use maybe an aperture like f11, and you should get pretty much the whole scene in focus, or at least that's what I found from the most recent roll and all the shots on it. They all turned out pretty much how I wanted them to, and in most of them, everything that I wanted to be in focus is in focus, and that is a big difference from how I was shooting at the start with lower apertures and that infinity focus, which I don't think I'll be doing again. Again, hopefully that makes sense. I feel like I'm kind of blabbering out a lot of information, but hopefully, hopefully it makes sense to you. This is another thing that I think is quite important. It depends on what camera you have. The Yashica TLR that I'm using goes as low as a 1 second shutter, so I haven't actually had to use the cable release yet, but if your camera doesn't, getting one of those, using it on a tripod, is very useful. Not only does it massively reduce the risk of there being any motion blur from camera shake, but it also allows you to use much lower shutter speeds and get a sharp image. It's also quite essential if your camera doesn't have a timer. Luckily, this one does, which surprised me when I got it. But if your camera doesn't have one, definitely grab yourself a shutter release button, because you just don't want motion blur in your shots. Unless that is what you're going for, then crack on, do your thing. Now, I definitely don't have enough film photography experience to be given too many tips, but I think this one is something you should probably try and will work from what I've seen most of the time. And it worked for me very well in the most recent video, if you've seen it. So if you're not sure how to expose a scene, you've maybe done a little bit of metering and there's quite a big dynamic range, or you're just not sure in general if you should overexpose a little bit or maybe underexpose, I would always go with overexpose by a stop, or if you're using portrait, maybe 2 stops, which is what I done in this video. And it's something that I hadn't really done too much in the first 2 videos, or the first 2 rolls of film that I shot. It's definitely something I should have done more on the first roll, and something I will be doing a lot more going forward, because what I've learned from shooting film so far is that it has quite a huge dynamic range, or at least portrait from what I've seen. I'm yet to try other films, but definitely when you're shooting portrait, the dynamic range is kind of crazy, especially when it comes to bringing back the highlights. Often when you get your scans back, the sky will look overexposed, and just by lowering those highlights, it brings all the detail back, and it's pretty satisfying to do actually. But it's definitely not as easy when it comes to the shadows if you underexpose, trying to correct the image and get the contrast looking right. It ends up looking a little bit muddy looking, and with underexposing you also run the risk of getting some weird color casts on your photos and stuff, which can be easy corrected, but it's just not a great starting point. Whereas when you overexpose a little bit, you just drag the highlights back and you're kind of ready to go. So yeah, if you're not sure, maybe err on the side of overexposing by a stop or two, and more than likely you probably will be able to recover those highlights, or at least that's what I've found so far anyway. But yeah, those are the things I've learned and changed from my first roll of film to my third roll, and really improved my photos, or at least I think so anyway. I've ordered quite a few rolls of film to shoot in this thing quite soon, including the new Kodak Gold, which is quite exciting. Looking forward to see how that turns out, and a few other ones as well, and I also still have some that Christina got me at Christmas time to try out. So looking forward to that. Still haven't got sick of looking at this thing, by the way. But anyway, I just thought I would share that because we did get quite a few comments on the recent video with a lot of you saying you loved how the photos turned out, and I just thought I would share how I've improved my film photography over the past couple of months. But I suppose I will stop blabbering. Hopefully some of you found that helpful. If you did, make sure to give the video a thumbs up, maybe consider subscribing if you want to see more. And yeah, I think that is everything for this one. So as we always say, take it easy, don't be a stranger.